Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated at just 23 years old. He was called a heretic, his name was erased, and his ideas were banned. Not because he cursed or insulted, but because he thought with a level of freedom few had ever dared before him. Instead of believing in a God separate from the world, Spinoza saw nature itself as divine. Instead of a morality based on fear, he built an ethics rooted in reason and joy. His books were hunted down, but his ideas survived. And today, you're about to dive into the boldest and most forbidden philosophy of the modern era. Nothing here is shallow. You're stepping into the mind of a man who challenged centuries of tradition with just one weapon: reason. This is the forbidden philosophy of Baruch Spinoza. Imagine a time when God was seen as a supreme ruler, sitting on a heavenly throne, outside the world, judging, intervening, rewarding some, punishing others. Now, imagine a bold philosopher, the son of Portuguese Jewish refugees living in Amsterdam, standing up against centuries of religious tradition and declaring, in plain terms, God is nature. Not as a metaphor, literally, Deus sive Natura, God or nature, is the radical formula of Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher who was excommunicated for thinking too much. To Spinoza, God isn't some personal being with moods, intentions, or emotions. He doesn't get angry, he doesn't show mercy, he doesn't punish, and he doesn't demand worship. God isn't outside reality, God is reality itself. Everything that exists is an expression of one infinite, eternal, necessary, and self-sustaining substance, God nature. In his masterpiece, Ethics, written more geometrico, in the style of geometry, Spinoza states, "By God I understand a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting of infinite attributes. This one substance, God or nature, is causa sui, cause of itself, meaning its essence implies its existence. God wasn't created and cannot stop existing. He is the foundation of everything that is, and more. Nothing exists outside this substance, not in time, not in space, not even in thought." Here, Spinoza breaks completely with Descartes' dualism, the idea that mind and body, thought and matter, are separate things. Instead, he offers a monist view of reality. There is only one reality, and everything that exists, thoughts, emotions, bodies, ideas, galaxies, are just modes of that one substance. They're finite expressions of an infinite reality. This view is both profound and liberating. If everything is God, then there's no room for sin in the traditional sense. There's no divine punishment, just ignorance of how nature works. Spinoza invites us to understand nature as it is, not as we wish it to be. To know the necessary order of reality, for him, is the true path to freedom. But let's be clear, when Spinoza says God is nature, he's not reducing God to just physical matter or dirt and rocks. Nature, for Spinoza, has two aspects: Natura naturans, nature as the creative force, the eternal power behind everything that exists; Natura naturata, nature as the product, everything that has been created and is governed by eternal laws. Spinoza identifies God with Natura naturans, the active source of reality, the internal cause behind everything. This means God isn't passive or distant, but a living, immanent force expressed in the logical, rational structure of the universe. This idea shakes the core of traditional theology. God didn't choose to create the world. The world flows necessarily from his nature. There are no miracles, no random acts. Everything unfolds from the essence of God with absolute necessity. That's why Spinoza says, "Things could not have been produced by God in any other way, nor in any other order." To many that might sound cold, deterministic, even harsh. But to Spinoza, it's the purest love of reality. Accepting the world as it is, understanding its causes, is the key to true freedom and inner peace. He calls this the intellectual love of God. the deep joy that comes from understanding and feeling connected to the order of everything. By identifying God with nature, Spinoza also frees us from religious anthropomorphism. God has no face, no gender, no preferences. He doesn't get mad at us, test us, or interfere to reward or punish. That may feel unsettling for those raised to think of God as a loving father in the sky. But at the same time, it's radically inclusive. Everything is in God. Everything shares the same essence. Nothing is left out of the divine order. This is the kind of thinking that led Goethe to say, "Spinoza was a man who inspired reverence in me. Through him, I learned to look at the world with deeper calm." And maybe that's the most fascinating part of Spinoza's philosophy, this deep calm. Instead of religious fear, he offers an ethics of understanding. He invites us to let go of the illusion of a God who rules like a king and instead embrace a rational spirituality, where God isn't above us, but within everything, including us. This identification of God with nature isn't just a philosophical thesis, it's a spiritual revolution. It asks us to abandon fantasies of control and start living more clearly, more connected, and more truthfully. After all, as Spinoza himself says, everything that is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. To understand Baruch Spinoza's philosophy, you have to shift how you look at the world. We're used to seeing everything as separate. Me, you, the sky, the tree, pain, an idea. Everything seems to live in its own compartment, each thing isolated and distinct. But Spinoza invites us to see reality as a single, unified whole. For him, there aren't multiple substances like Descartes or Aristotle thought. There is only one. This is the foundation of his metaphysics, substantial monism. In simple terms, it means that there's just one single substance in the entire universe, and this substance is infinite, eternal, necessary, and self-existing. Everything else, bodies, minds, thoughts, emotions, objects, are just modes of this one substance. Spinoza defines substance as something that exists in and by itself, something that doesn't depend on anything else to exist or to be understood. Modes, on the other hand, are the ways in which this substance expresses itself. For example, you, right now, reading this text, are a mode of the substance. Your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, all of these are expressions of it. You're not something separate from reality. You are reality in a particular form. So why does Spinoza say there can only be one substance? Because if there were two or more, they'd have to differ in something, either in their attributes, the kind of reality they are, or in their essence. But a substance that is infinite already includes all attributes, so there's no room for another. And if something doesn't differ in essence, then it isn't a different substance. That means the idea of multiple substances is just an illusion, a product of our imagination, which breaks things apart to understand them, but forgets that these parts are never really separate from the whole. This is a radical idea. It breaks completely with the Cartesian tradition, which said there are two independent substances, res extensa, the substance of matter and the body, and res cogitans, the substance of thought and the mind. Spinoza says that's nonsense. Body and mind aren't two different things. They're two ways the same substance shows itself. Or in his words, they are two attributes of God, appearing at the same time. This idea is at the core of his ethics, and it can be summed up in one famous line: everything that is in God, and nothing can exist or be understood without God. But what does that really mean? It means that there's no outside of God, and no outside of nature. All of reality is contained in a single essence. Everything that happens, from the movement of the stars to your deepest thoughts, is an expression of this one substance, which Spinoza calls God or nature, Deus, sive, Natura. This substance is infinite. It contains everything that can possibly be. Eternal, it had no beginning, and it will never end. It wasn't created, and it can't be destroyed. Necessary, It doesn't depend on anything outside itself. Its very essence guarantees its existence, self-existing. It exists on its own. It wasn't made by anything else. And everything that exists in time, everything that changes, is born, dies. That's us. We are finite modes of this infinite substance. Here, Spinoza gives us more than just a metaphysical idea. He offers a whole new way to relate to life. When we understand that we are not separate islands, but fleeting expressions of something much greater, we can begin to see ourselves with more humility and more connection to the universe. This view dissolves the ego that sees itself as the center of the world. We're not separate beings fighting against the universe. We are the universe, showing up in one particular way. That can sound strange, maybe even uncomfortable, but it can also be incredibly freeing. Imagine, just for a second, that everything you are, your body, your mind, your emotions, are not disconnected pieces floating in the cosmos, but expressions of the same infinite and eternal reality. You are not separate from the whole. You are like a wave in the ocean of substance. And like every wave, you are finite. But the thing you're made of is eternal. Your deepest being is the very being of reality itself. This changes everything. It changes how we deal with suffering, fear, even death. If we are modes of something eternal, then we don't really disappear, we just change form. The substance goes on. Centuries later, Nietzsche would see Spinoza as a kindred spirit, a precursor. Both rejected the idea of a transcendent world, the split between heaven and earth. Both embraced life as it is, without escaping to some other world. In that sense, Spinoza's monism is the foundation for a new kind of ethics, one based on reason, immanence, and acceptance of reality. That's why Spinoza isn't just another philosopher. He's a turning point. His idea of a single substance challenges not only philosophy, but also spirituality, science, politics, and most of all, how we understand what it means to be human. For Spinoza, freedom doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It's not about acting on a whim, as if we were absolute masters of our will. And it's definitely not free will in the traditional sense. The idea that human beings are some kind of exception in nature, capable of making magical decisions outside the laws of cause and effect. Spinoza completely rejects that. For him, true freedom isn't about escaping necessity. It's about understanding it. In his Ethics, Spinoza writes, "Men think they are free because they are aware of their actions, but unaware of the causes that determine them." This is one of the most powerful and provocative lines in his entire work. In other words, we believe we're free simply because we don't see the forces that move us. We mistake ignorance for freedom. But if everything follows the laws of nature, if everything that exists is just a mode of the one and only substance, God or nature, then nothing escapes the necessary order of the universe. Nothing happens by chance, and nothing is free in the sense of being outside the chain of causes. Not even our thoughts, desires, or decisions. So, are we doomed to a mechanical, deterministic life? Not at all. And this is where Spinoza offers one of the most transformative ideas in his entire philosophy. Freedom isn't the absence of causes, it's the awareness of them. Freedom, for Spinoza, is rational activity. When we're driven by our passions, we're like leaves in the wind, reacting to the world without understanding it. We're influenced by external forces, controlled by desires we didn't choose, fears we don't understand, beliefs we inherited. In that state, we live in bondage. But when we begin to understand why we feel what we feel, why we desire what we desire, and why we act the way we do, we start to regain our autonomy. To know the cause is, in a way, to participate in it consciously. That's what Spinoza calls freedom. It's like a pianist who, at first, just repeats movements without really knowing what they're doing. But as they learn music theory, chords, scales, and the intention behind the notes, they stop being a mere performer and become a conscious creator of music. Freedom lies in understanding the order, not breaking it. The same goes for us. As we understand the necessity of things, their causes, logic, and how they fit into the order of nature, we become active rather than passive. We begin to act based on reason, not just instinct. That's why Spinoza says that the truly free person is the one who lives guided by reason. Not because they stand outside nature, but because they are a conscious part of it. It's important to see that this view of freedom isn't pessimistic. It doesn't say we're puppets. It says we are nature itself, and that reason is its highest expression in us. The more rational our understanding of the world, the freer we become. And the more we let ourselves be led by confusion, irrational passions, or second-hand ideas, the more we are slaves to things we don't even grasp. Spinoza goes so far as to say, freedom is acting according to the necessity of our own nature, that is, living according to reason. Notice that for him, living according to reason doesn't mean repressing emotions. It means understanding where they come from, how they work, and what they lead to. It's making the mind stronger than the impulse. It's living in a way where emotions don't drag us around, but teach us something about who we really are. When we do this, Spinoza says, we become more powerful, more capable of affirming our existence, more in control of ourselves, and closer to active joy, which he sees as the highest ethical good. This idea hits home in everyday life. How many times have we acted on impulse, out of anger, jealousy, pride, or fear, only to realize later that it wasn't truly us making the decision, but a storm that carried us away? Spinoza's idea of freedom is the antidote to that state. It's an inner freedom built through patience, self-knowledge, and reason. And it also frees us from unnecessary guilt. If we understand that human actions, including our own, follow natural laws and causes, we can let go of self-hate and resentment. We can replace judgment with understanding. And from that place, we can act in a way that is more fair, more conscious, more truly human. Freedom, then, isn't a mystical gift. It's not a privilege for the few. It's a process. It's the path of reason, overcoming the slavery of ignorance. It's, as Spinoza puts it, living with rational joy, accepting the order of the world, not out of resignation, but out of wisdom. And you? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why you feel what you feel? To what extent are your choices truly yours? Do you act because you understand, or are you just reacting? For Baruch Spinoza, there's no illusion more harmful than the belief in absolute free will. The idea that humans are free to choose whatever they want, as if we were little autonomous empires inside the universe, is one of the biggest mistakes in traditional philosophy and theology. Spinoza strongly rejects this view and offers something radical and transformative. Free will doesn't exist. Human beings are not a kingdom within a kingdom. We act under the same natural laws that govern the stars, the growth of plants, and the flow of rivers. In his Ethics, Spinoza puts it bluntly. Men think themselves free because they are conscious of their actions and ignorant of the causes by which they are determined. This is the heart of Spinoza's critique of free will. The freedom we believe we have is actually a result of ignorance, an illusion created by our lack of awareness of the real causes behind our thoughts, feelings, and actions. Spinoza uses a classic analogy to make this point clear. Imagine a stone being thrown through the air. If the stone were suddenly able to gain consciousness during its flight, it would believe it was moving of its own free will. Not knowing about the hand that launched it, the stone would think it was the cause of its own motion. That's exactly how humans act when we believe we have free will. We're aware of our actions, but unaware of the deeper forces that put them in motion. And what are these forces? Our emotions, desires, impulses, and ideas, all shaped by countless external causes, which were themselves shaped by others, in an endless chain. We didn't choose to be born, we didn't choose our family, and we didn't choose the first ideas that shaped our view of the world. All of this molds us. Even our most personal, free decisions only feel free because we don't fully understand the causes behind them. Spinoza isn't attacking the idea of free will just to defend determinism. What he's really doing is putting humans back into nature. One of the biggest mistakes in both philosophy and religion, he says, was imagining that humans are separate from the natural world, as if we had immortal souls, pure reason, and free will. This creates a false divide. On one side, nature, ruled by fixed and necessary laws. On the other, humans, with some kind of supernatural power. Against this, Spinoza says, humans are part of nature. We're governed by its laws, just like everything else. And this isn't a downgrade. It's a kind of liberation. When we recognize that we're part of the whole, we begin to live with more clarity, humility, and compassion. His statement, "Man is not an empire within an empire," is a direct challenge to those who try to build morality, religion, and politics on the magical idea of free will. Because when people believe in this false freedom, they become harsh judges, punishing, blaming, and condemning others and themselves, without even trying to understand the real causes behind human behavior. This idea has deep ethical and political consequences. By rejecting free will, Spinoza isn't letting us off the hook. He's calling us to a more grounded and meaningful kind of responsibility, understanding the forces that shape us, so we can turn ignorance into wisdom. For Spinoza, real freedom doesn't come from escaping causes. It comes from understanding them. He calls this rational freedom. The more we understand the causes that affect us, the more we can act consciously, instead of just reacting blindly. And the more we understand others in the same way, the less we judge, and the more we build a world based on understanding and cooperation. Also, by rejecting free will, Spinoza challenges the traditional idea of guilt. If no one is absolutely free, then no one is absolutely guilty either. That doesn't mean evil or mistakes don't exist. It means they should be understood in terms of the causes that produce them, not treated as some kind of mystical violation of imaginary freedom. Spinoza's perspective is both strict and freeing. It takes away the comforting idea that we're in total control, but gives us something deeper, the maturity to see that freedom is built, not given. It comes from understanding what determines us, not from pretending we're above it. Naturally, this idea was controversial in his time, and it's still uncomfortable today. We live in a world that celebrates individual autonomy, that tells us we're the authors of our story, free to be whatever we want. Spinoza reminds us that this view is an illusion. We are determined, just like everything else in the universe. But by accepting this, and by placing ourselves back within nature, we open the door to a kind of freedom that isn't magical or absolute, but is real, clear-minded, and possible. Among all the concepts in Spinoza's philosophy, Conatus is perhaps the most vital, the most alive, and the closest to our immediate experience of being. It's the inner drive, the effort that every single thing makes to keep on existing. It's a simple yet profound idea. Everything that exists by its very nature tries to keep existing. Nothing wants to stop being. Nothing acts against itself, unless it's out of ignorance or because of outside forces. Spinoza defines Conatus in part 3 of the Ethics with these clear words: each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives to persist in its being. This effort to persist, Conatus, is not optional, not moral, not even conscious or unconscious. It's ontological. It's part of what a thing is. An animal tries to survive. A plant leans toward the light. A rock holds itself together. And human beings, in all their complexity, also strive to keep existing. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and rationally. Saying that Conatus is a fundamental principle in Spinoza's ethics is no exaggeration. It explains why we act, why we feel, why we desire, why we suffer, why we seek knowledge. Everything in us comes from this core impulse to affirm our own existence. Even love, reason, and freedom, in Spinoza's view, only exist because of this effort to keep being. But Conatus is not just a biological survival instinct. It goes deeper. It's the expression of our essential being, the manifestation within us of the one and only substance, God or nature, that constantly seeks to affirm itself in finite forms. When Spinoza talks about human Conatus, he's not just describing a primitive instinct. He's pointing to the very essence of the individual as an expression of divine power. So humans aren't driven by some magical free will. They are moved by this inner effort to persist. And when something blocks that effort, whether it's illness, ignorance, external oppression, or weakening emotions, they become less active, less powerful, less free. Understanding Conatus means understanding what makes us more alive, more capable, more authentic. Spinoza's ethics is deeply tied to the idea that virtue is simply our power to act. The more we act according to our true nature, not reacting blindly or driven by destructive passions, the more virtuous we are. And to act according to our nature means preserving and expanding our own being. That's why Spinoza says, the effort to preserve one's own being is the first and only foundation of virtue. This turns traditional ethics upside down. For Spinoza, there are no external commandments from a higher power. Ethics comes from human nature itself. Doing good is whatever increases our power to exist. Doing harm is whatever weakens or destroys us, whatever alienates us from ourselves. Goodness isn't in some ideal heaven, but in the real, daily exercise of our own nature. Here, Conatus connects with our emotions. When something supports our power to exist, we feel joy. When something threatens that power, we feel sadness. Spinoza's ethics is an ethics of emotional power, where feelings aren't dismissed but understood as signals of our state of being. The more joyful and active we are, the closer we are to freedom. The more sad and passive, the further we drift from our true selves. This idea has powerful consequences in real life. Think of someone caught in destructive cycles, toxic relationships, addictions, self-sabotage. From Spinoza's perspective, that person isn't choosing to mess up. They're being guided by harmful emotions that weaken their conatus. They're being shaped by causes that block their ability to fully persist in their being. So the path to freedom doesn't come from guilt, punishment, or repression. It comes from understanding the causes that pull us away from who we are. And that understanding can only come through reason. Knowing the real causes of what we feel and do is the beginning of true ethics. Conatus, then, isn't just a metaphysical idea. It's an existential principle. It's what moves us, what orients us, what calls us to live with awareness. It reminds us that life is an act of resistance, of affirmation, of continuously building ourselves, and that all life wants more life. It wants to remain, to grow, and to understand itself. In Baruch Spinoza's view, human beings weren't made to obey outside commands or live tormented by guilt and false hopes. For him, living ethically doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for some invisible authority. Instead, it means reaching the highest level of understanding and joy that a rational being can experience. And that ultimate point, the peak of human existence, is what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis. For Spinoza, this love represents the highest form of both knowledge and ethics. But it's not mystical, and it's not emotional in the usual sense. It's a kind of rational, active, and eternal joy, a deep understanding that connects us directly to the infinite substance of which we are a part, God or nature, Deus, sive, Natura. To understand this intellectual love, we first need to look at how Spinoza defines knowledge. In his Ethics, he describes three types of knowledge. The first kind is imaginative knowledge, based on sensory experience, memories, and mixed-up images. The second kind is rational knowledge, based on shared ideas and logical thinking. The third kind is intuitive knowledge, the highest form of knowing, where we grasp something directly through its unique essence in relation to God's essence. It's in this third kind of knowledge that the intellectual love of God happens. It doesn't come from prayer, religious rituals, or blind faith. It comes from direct, clear, and intuitive understanding of the eternal structure of reality. When we see things from the perspective of eternity, sub specie eternitatis, we realize that everything, including ourselves, is an expression of God, and that realization leads to love. But what kind of love is this? Spinoza says that the intellectual love of God is actually God loving himself through us. When we understand God, we become the source of joy within ourselves. And since everything is an expression of one single substance, this love is both ours and God's at the same time. This love is eternal. That means it's not like ordinary emotions that come and go based on external causes. This love is necessary and eternal because it comes from knowing God's eternal essence. And since reason, as part of thought, is one of God's attributes, it connects us to his eternity. Here, Spinoza uses the idea of love, a central theme in most religions, but strips it of human traits and mysticism. God, in his view, doesn't have emotions. He doesn't love or hate or desire. God is the rational structure of the universe. So, the intellectual love of God is simply the highest joy that we can feel when we understand that structure. It's important to remember that Spinoza never leaves reason behind. For him, salvation, freedom, and happiness don't come from emotional highs or blind belief. They come from understanding reality through reason. The more we understand, the freer we become. The freer we are, the more joyful we become. And the more joyful we are, the more we love God, or rather, life as a whole, clearly understood. This love is also a kind of self-love and love for everything around us. There's no division between ourselves and the world. No clash between reason and emotion. Spinoza's idea of reason is not cold or detached. It's deeply alive. While many people think reason makes us distant, Spinoza believed it brings us closer to everything, because it helps us see how everything fits into the infinite web of existence. This love also sets us free. One of the key goals in Spinoza's ethics is to break free from the trap of destructive emotions, hope and fear, pride and shame, joy and sadness. The intellectual love of God helps us escape that cycle. It doesn't depend on outside situations. It's an inner joy, active and based on clarity and understanding. And it's not something reserved for scholars or spiritual leaders. Spinoza believed anyone who dedicates themselves to rational understanding can reach this love. It's a universal path. Difficult, yes, but fully open to anyone who wants to understand themselves and the world in a deep and honest way. At the heart of Spinoza's ethics, this love is also a form of eternity. He didn't believe in the soul living on in heaven or life after death in the traditional sense. For him, what's eternal in us is the part of the mind that understands things from the perspective of eternity. That awareness connects us to God's eternal nature, and that connection is the intellectual love. This view is powerful because it replaces the fear of death with a deep, rational joy. We're not clinging to fantasies about rewards or punishments. We live more intensely the more we understand. Eternity isn't something that happens after life. It's found in the quality of consciousness we bring to life itself. In traditional ethics, being virtuous usually means obeying a set of moral rules, commands imposed by some external authority, a religion, or social custom. Virtue is often seen as the suppression of desires, denial of the body, and going against nature. But Baruch Spinoza offers a radical shift in this idea. For him, virtue is not about repression, it's about power. It's not about submission, it's about freedom. To be virtuous, in Spinoza's view, is to be more active, more rational, and therefore more free. Virtue isn't a list of rules to follow. It's the degree of power we reach when we live according to our essential nature, guided by reason instead of being ruled by our emotions. This idea is based on the concept of Conatus, which we've discussed before, the fundamental drive of each being to persist in its own existence. Spinoza's ethics are grounded in this basic force of life. Anything that increases our power to act, anything that makes us more autonomous, clear-minded, and fulfilled, is good. Anything that weakens us, makes us passive, confused, or dependent on external causes, is bad. Virtue, then, is the highest expression of who we are. It's not just surviving, it's living fully as rational beings, aware of what drives us, and capable of acting with clarity instead of just reacting blindly. Spinoza puts it clearly. Virtue, or power to act, is the very essence of man, insofar as it is defined by the laws of his own nature. This means virtue is inseparable from freedom and knowledge. A virtuous person is someone who knows themselves, understands the causes of their emotions, acts through reason, and participates actively in the natural order. But what does it really mean to act actively? Spinoza draws a line between actions and passions. An action is something we do from our own nature, with awareness and clarity. A passion is something we suffer. It's when something outside of us affects us, and we don't fully understand why. For example, if someone insults us and we react with anger, we're being passive, dominated by an emotion we don't control. But if we understand the cause of the insult and respond with clarity, we're acting through reason. That's virtue. So virtue is inseparable from rational activity. But let's be clear, this doesn't mean coldness or apathy. For Spinoza, reason doesn't erase emotions. It helps organize and transform them. Being rational doesn't mean we stop feeling. It means we feel in a way that makes sense, that fits our nature and the reality around us. And what comes from this? Joy. Because for Spinoza, joy is what we feel when our power to exist increases. When we act virtuously, we experience an active joy different from quick pleasure or shallow excitement. It's a deeper, lasting joy that comes from living in alignment with who we are. So, virtue isn't a burden. It's an inner achievement. It's not a moral weight. It's an expression of freedom. The more virtuous we are, the freer we become. Because freedom, in Spinoza's view, means the ability to act based on the necessity of our own nature, not from outside pressures or chaotic impulses. This also means no one can be virtuous out of fear or blind obedience. If virtue is forced, it's no longer virtue. Spinoza's ethics are liberating because they start from human nature as it really is. He doesn't demand that we become saints or angels. He invites us to be fully human, with clarity and strength. That's why Spinoza says, "The virtuous man is the one who lives by the guidance of reason." To live by reason is to live in harmony with nature, not against it. It means recognizing that our emotions are not enemies, but signals. And the way to handle them isn't to suppress them, but to understand their causes and direct them with a clear sense of purpose. This perspective has real impact on our daily lives. Instead of blaming ourselves for mistakes or repressing our desires, Spinoza urges us to ask, what's driving me? What increases or decreases my power to be? Am I acting from myself or being dragged by external forces? The answers don't come from dogma. They come from practicing reason. And this practice takes effort, perseverance, and self-awareness, virtues that only grow when we stop waiting for some transcendent good and start cultivating the real good in our concrete, lived experience. In times of crisis, anxiety, and distraction, Spinoza's ethics offer a clear path. To be virtuous is to become more active, more aware, and more powerful. There are no commandments, just the logic of life, clearly understood. And once we gain that clarity, it transforms into joy and freedom. For Baruch Spinoza, freedom is not a gift. It's not an innate right, much less some mystical illusion. In his philosophy, true freedom is an inner transformation, a state we can only reach through the full use of reason. It's only when reason takes the lead in our lives that we stop being slaves to our emotions and start living actively, clearly, and authentically. But before we understand the role of reason, We need to grasp what Spinoza means by human bondage. But in ethics, he says that a person is a slave as long as they're ruled by their passions. That's not a metaphor, it's a real condition. When someone is controlled by outside emotions, driven by impulses they don't understand, and tossed around by confusing feelings, they're like a prisoner inside their own mind. A person can't restrain passions except with stronger passions. So bondage is the state in which someone doesn't understand what they feel or why they act. They're moved by external forces and simply react, almost like a puppet of random events. Their actions aren't truly their own. They're reactions, fueled by fear, blind desire, anger, envy, or sadness. This state of passivity goes against human nature, which is, at its core, rational, and that's where reason comes in as a tool for freedom. For Spinoza, reason is the ability to understand the true causes of things, to form clear ideas, to recognize the necessary order of nature, and to see oneself as part of that order. The more we develop our reasoning, the more active we become, meaning we act based on understanding, not out of ignorance. Reason helps us see that emotions, no matter how strong, aren't mysterious or uncontrollable. They are effects of causes, and those causes can be understood and transformed. Take sadness, for example. It's not divine punishment or some fixed trait in our personality. It's a sign that our ability to act has been reduced by something external. Knowing that is the first step to changing the situation. Reason doesn't eliminate emotions, it organizes them, brings them into the light, and gives them direction. It transforms painful, passive feelings into active ones. It builds bridges between emotion and understanding. It educates desire instead of repressing it. Because for Spinoza, reason isn't the enemy of emotion, it's its most powerful ally. That's why he says, the power of reason is freedom itself. To be free, then, doesn't mean doing whatever we want. It means wanting what comes from understanding our own nature. Reason teaches us how to want wisely, how to choose what actually increases our power to exist, not just what satisfies a quick impulse. Being free means acting with clarity and knowing why we want what we want. Reason also frees us from fear. When we understand that everything in the world follows the laws of nature, we stop being afraid of punishment, curses, or unexplained misfortunes. We realize everything has a cause, and if we understand that cause, we can prepare for it, act on it, even change it. This rational perspective is deeply liberating, especially when compared to traditional ideas that tie freedom to random choices, disconnected from deeper meaning. Spinoza shows us that there is no real freedom without understanding. Without reason, we're like leaves in the wind. With reason, we become pilots steering our own lives. And this rational freedom isn't cold or lifeless. On the contrary, when reason leads the way, it brings us to what Spinoza calls active joy. A deep sense of contentment that comes from understanding life and living in harmony with reality. Reason also connects us to others. When we understand human nature as part of nature itself, we stop seeing people as enemies or competitors. We start to see them as different expressions of the same essence. Reason leads to true empathy, not the unstable kind based on emotion, but the solid kind rooted in understanding that everyone is trying to persist in their own way, just like we are. This kind of freedom, born from reason, is lasting. It doesn't depend on outside conditions. While passions come and go and make us depend on things we can't control, reason creates an inner stability that can handle even life's toughest moments with clarity. The human mind has something eternal. That eternity is reason seeing things sub specie eternitatis, from the perspective of eternity. It's the state of someone who lives in tune with reality, not against it. Someone who loves the world as it is, because they understand it. Spinoza doesn't promise easy freedom. He knows the path of reason takes effort, attention, and persistence. But he's clear, it's the only real path, the only true freedom. Not the illusion of choice, but the power to act rooted in real understanding. And you, What's guiding you right now? Reason or emotion? Are your decisions based on self-knowledge or just passing reactions? Do you truly feel free or just distracted from your own bondage? Baruch Spinoza might be one of the most radical and most misunderstood thinkers when it comes to the idea of God. Excommunicated from the Jewish community at just 23, labeled an atheist by his peers, and later praised by philosophers for centuries, Spinoza offered a view that broke away from centuries of Western religious tradition. He completely rejected the idea of an anthropomorphic God, that is, a God made in the image and likeness of humans, with desires, intentions, emotions, and moral judgments. To Spinoza, this kind of God is simply a projection of the human imagination, a symbolic creation that reflects more about our fears and desires than the true nature of the divine. Men conceive God as a man, but greater than all others, and assign to him human emotions like love, hate, anger, and mercy. This critique hits hard. It challenges not only specific religions, but also the way people tend to relate to the sacred. By creating a God in their own image, instead of trying to understand what God truly is. According to Spinoza, this human-like view of God comes from ignorance. When people are faced with random or tragic events like illness, natural disasters, or personal loss, they look for answers. And when they can't find a visible cause, they often blame it on some mysterious divine will. This God of the gaps fills in where reason hasn't reached yet, but in doing so, distorts reality and turns God into a moody being driven by feelings and whims, just like us. Spinoza proposes a radical redefinition. God is nature. Deus sive Natura. God isn't some being outside the world, but the eternal, infinite substance that expresses itself in everything that exists. He doesn't have will, because having a will implies making choices, and making choices implies limitations. But God, being absolutely infinite, cannot be limited by anything. So he doesn't want, choose, love, or get angry. He simply is. To give God human traits, for Spinoza, is a major philosophical and theological mistake. It shrinks the infinite into something finite, turns necessity into randomness, and makes the eternal seem temporary. It reduces the true order of reality into a human drama, where God gets offended, punishes, rewards, or changes his mind like an earthly king. To Spinoza, that's superstition. And superstition is the opposite of reason. In his Theological-Political treatise, Spinoza makes this point clearly. If triangles could speak, they would say God is eminently triangular. This ironic phrase is a sharp criticism of religious anthropocentrism. Just as a triangle would imagine a God shaped like itself, humans imagine a God with their own emotions. But divine truth doesn't fit our image. We're the ones who must seek to understand it as it truly is, even if that means being uncomfortable or humbled by it. Spinoza believed that this false view of God is not just intellectually weak, it's dangerous. It supports systems of power built on fear, guilt, and blind obedience. A God with a will of his own can be used to justify anything: wars, persecution, punishment, oppression. By rejecting this personal and human-like God, Spinoza aims to free human thought from religious bondage. But it's important to be clear. Spinoza is not an atheist. He rejects the God of dogmatic religions, but affirms a deeper, more universal understanding of God. To him, God is the one and only substance, the cause of itself, causa sui, infinite and eternal, from which everything that exists flows. God is the necessary order of reality, the totality of existence, a being that expresses itself through infinite attributes, of which we only know two: thought and extension. This God doesn't judge, save, punish, or speak through miracles or revelations. We come to know God through reason, not through faith. And true love of God, what Spinoza calls intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis, isn't emotional or based on expectations. It's the deep joy that comes from understanding the structure of reality and finding peace in its eternal harmony. Spinoza's critique of religious anthropomorphism also has political and practical consequences. In his view, religions that insist on a personal God end up leading people away from true virtue. Instead of encouraging reason and the common good, they promote fear, intolerance, and submission. That's why, in the Theological-Political Treatise, Spinoza argues for a separation between theology and philosophy. Faith should serve civil obedience and basic moral practice, something everyone can follow. But the search for truth belongs to philosophy and must remain free from religious control. Philosophy, guided by reason, teaches us to love God not as a heavenly Father, but as the eternal and necessary order of the universe. That's Spinoza's ultimate proposal, to replace the God made in man's image with a vision of humanity in harmony with God nature. Not subjects of a divine king, but conscious participants in a totality that both shapes us and includes us. In Baruch Spinoza's philosophy, true slavery isn't about physical chains. It's about what happens inside the human soul when we become prisoners of our own uncontrolled emotions, chaotic desires, and impulsive reactions. This is what Spinoza calls human bondage, servitudo humana, a state of weakness and dependency in which a person has very little control and is constantly being controlled by forces within. This isn't a moral condemnation. It's an honest and precise description of human experience. For Spinoza, we are in a state of bondage whenever we live passively, when we don't understand the causes behind our emotions and end up being dragged around by them like leaves in the wind. Man is powerless to control his passions except by opposing them with stronger ones. In other words, when we don't guide our lives with reason, we're not truly in charge of ourselves. We're just reacting to things we don't understand. Anger, jealousy, envy, uncontrollable ambition, fear, these are all examples of emotions that cloud our thinking and push us into self-destructive actions, even when we think we're in control. But why does this happen? Spinoza explains that our minds are made up of ideas. Some are adequate, clear, rational, well-formed, while others are inadequate, confused, based on imagination or unclear experiences. When we act based on inadequate ideas, we're passive. When we act based on adequate ideas, we become active. That's the key to understanding freedom versus bondage. To be free is to act with awareness and clarity, knowing why we feel and do what we do. To be in bondage is to be driven by emotions we don't understand, living reactively and vulnerably. This makes human bondage both incredibly common and hard to notice. A lot of people think they're making free choices, when in fact they're just obeying whatever emotion happens to be strongest at the moment. Spinoza would say, it's not true freedom if you're choosing between fear and desire without understanding what's behind those feelings. This bondage also shows up in our internal struggles, the kind we all face, the person who wants to change but can't, who knows what they should do but ends up doing the opposite, who is torn between what they know and what they feel. Spinoza sees this as a sign of inner weakness, a battle between emotions that haven't yet been organized and understood by reason. That's why he writes, man's power is extremely limited and surpassed by countless other forces around him. But Spinoza isn't pessimistic. His philosophy isn't saying we're doomed to be slaves to our emotions forever. On the contrary, his work is a call to liberation, but it's not a liberation that comes from outside, not from God, not from a savior. The only real freedom, according to Spinoza, comes from within, from reason, and from the hard but rewarding effort to understand ourselves and the forces that shape us. That's the beauty of Spinoza's vision. He doesn't idealize humans as flawless beings. He sees us as beings in struggle. Yes, we may live in bondage, but we can grow stronger, educate ourselves, and change. How does that transformation happen? Through reason, which allows us to form adequate ideas. Through ethical practice, which means increasing our capacity to live fully and guiding our emotions toward what strengthens us and gives us more control. For example, When we realize that envy comes from comparing ourselves to others unfairly, and that this comparison weakens us, we begin to dissolve envy. When we see that anger makes us fragile and pulls us away from what we truly want, we start to replace it with something more useful. Spinoza never tells us to get rid of emotions entirely. That would go against our human nature. What he offers instead is a way to retrain our emotions, to understand and guide them using reason. Joy, for example, is a positive, active feeling that strengthens us. Love, when guided by reason, becomes a liberating force. Hope, when balanced, can be motivating. The problem isn't emotions themselves, it's when we become slaves to them. This perspective transforms how we think about human suffering. For Spinoza, suffering isn't a punishment from God or a moral failure. It's a sign of confusion, a quiet cry for deeper understanding. Every time we suffer from something we don't fully grasp, it's an invitation to slow down, pay attention, investigate, and get to know ourselves with more honesty. That's why Spinoza's ethics aren't about punishment. They're about healing. He doesn't give us external rules to obey. He invites us to rebuild ourselves from within. His message is simple and powerful. Real freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's wanting what you truly understand. That takes effort. But it leads to the only real peace. The peace of someone who acts with purpose, not someone who merely reacts. For Spinoza, knowledge isn't just about collecting information. To know is to transform the mind, to free ourselves from confusion and error so we can reach clarity and strength. In his philosophy, knowledge is more than just a mental tool. It's the path to true freedom. And this journey of the human mind unfolds in three major stages, which he calls the types of knowledge: imaginative, rational, and intuitive. Each of these types reflects a way of understanding reality, and at the same time, a level of freedom or servitude of the soul. The higher the type of knowledge, the more autonomy, clarity, and joy a person can experience. The lower the level, the more vulnerable we are to confusion, error, and emotional turmoil. 1. First type, imaginative knowledge. This is the most basic and limited kind of knowledge. It's the kind we get through the senses, vague experiences, memories, and language. Spinoza calls it knowledge by opinion or from signs. At this stage, our minds are shaped by images, associations, and fragmented perceptions. We see the world in bits and pieces, through chance encounters and emotional reactions. It's here that superstitions, biases, and popular beliefs take root. A simple example: if someone gets sick a few times after eating a certain food, they may assume that food is bad, even if they don't understand the real cause. This is what Spinoza would call an inadequate idea, an idea that doesn't match the true cause of what happened. Most people live primarily at this level. It's a shaky kind of knowledge that makes us slaves to our emotions and circumstances. We become prone to fear, false hope, jealousy, anger, all because we're interpreting life through fragments and appearances. Knowledge of the first kind is the only cause of falsity. But Spinoza doesn't condemn this stage. He sees it as the natural starting point of human thought. The problem isn't beginning here. The problem is staying here without trying to rise above it through reason. 2. Second type, rational knowledge. The second type is rational knowledge. At this level, we're no longer guided by disconnected images or random experiences, but by common ideas, logical thinking, and an understanding of the universal connections between things. This kind of knowledge helps us formulate laws, build science, and recognize necessary causes. For example, when we understand that water boils at 212 degrees, 100 degrees C, at standard pressure, we know it's not just happening by chance. It follows a constant natural law. Spinoza deeply values this type of understanding. It allows us to form adequate ideas, ideas that explain why things happen and free us from ignorance and emotional bondage. When we realize that our feelings have causes, that fear, jealousy, or sadness can be explained, we begin to take control of our lives instead of being pushed around by them. Rational knowledge is the foundation of Spinoza's ethics and the core of human freedom. It's not about cold logic, it's about emotional clarity. The more we understand, the better we can guide our emotions in line with reality. Still, this isn't the highest form of knowledge. Rational thinking is like a ladder, steady and secure. But there's an even higher stage, where the mind doesn't just deduce, but sees things directly. 3. Third type, intuitive knowledge. This is the highest form of understanding, what Spinoza calls the third kind of knowledge, or intuition. It's the kind of knowledge that sees things sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. It's not mystical or irrational, but a way of knowing that starts from the essence of a specific thing and directly grasps the essence of God, who is the substance behind everything. With intuitive knowledge, the mind sees the whole in the part. It's like recognizing a single puzzle piece and instantly understanding the full picture from it. This kind of knowledge is immediate and clear. No need for step-by-step logic. Spinoza says this knowledge leads to intellectual love of God, the highest form of rational joy. Knowledge of the third kind proceeds from the adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate idea of the essence of things. This level of knowledge connects the human mind to eternity. It brings true freedom because it aligns us with the necessary order of the universe. At this point, there are no more inner conflicts, no illusions, no blind hopes, only deep understanding and active joy. Levels of knowledge, levels of freedom. These 3 types of knowledge aren't just different ways of knowing, they're degrees of freedom. With imaginative knowledge, we are slaves to emotions and chance. With rational knowledge, we become free through understanding. With intuitive knowledge, we reach eternal joy and complete freedom. Spinoza's goal isn't to erase the lower stages, it's to transcend them. Imaginative knowledge is necessary. Rational knowledge is freeing. And intuitive knowledge is sublime. For Baruch Spinoza, knowledge is more than just a tool of reason. It's the very expression of human freedom. And within his powerful philosophical framework, intuitive knowledge represents the highest level of understanding, the ultimate form of knowing, and the peak of the human ethical and existential journey. This isn't intuition in the common sense, like a gut feeling or hunch. Spinoza uses the term intuition to describe a type of knowledge that's direct, clear, and complete. It doesn't rely on deductions or step-by-step reasoning. Instead, it comes from understanding the essence of an individual thing and seeing how it necessarily connects to the infinite substance, God or nature. This is the peak of what he calls the third kind of knowledge, tertius cognitionis genus, which he distinguishes from the first kind, imaginative knowledge, and the second kind, rational knowledge. Imaginative knowledge is confused and unstable, based on sensory images and fragmented experiences. Rational knowledge is more reliable, built from shared ideas and logical thinking. But intuitive knowledge goes further. It allows us to see reality as it truly is, sub specie eternitatis, from the perspective of eternity. From this third kind of knowledge comes the highest possible peace of mind. This peace of mind isn't just a fleeting emotion, it's a deep, lasting joy, a rational joy that comes from the mind being united with God. Or more precisely, from the mind understanding the necessary order of the universe as an expression of God's divine essence. So what does it mean to understand the essence of things in God? It means realizing that everything that exists is just a finite mode of the one infinite substance, which Spinoza calls God or nature. Every single thing, a tree, a human body, a thought, is a unique expression of that eternal whole. When we understand a thing in its true essence, we see it as it exists in God, as a link in the infinite chain of causes, governed by natural laws and connected to everything else. This kind of vision breaks away from our everyday view of the world, which sees things as separate and disconnected. At the imaginative level, we see things as random and accidental. At the rational level, we start to recognize patterns and necessity. But only at the intuitive level do we see everything as part of one unified reality. Here, there is no more conflict between the finite and the infinite, no more separation between the human and the divine. Intuitive knowledge doesn't dissolve the ego through denial, but through deep integration with reality as it truly is. When the mind grasps something intuitively, it participates in God's own eternity. The human mind, to the extent that it knows through this third kind, is part of God's infinite essence. This type of knowledge is also connected to what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, which is the highest goal of his ethical system. Because to know something intuitively is also to love its essence in God. And this love isn't a fleeting passion, it's an active joy, a rational connection to eternal being. So this is not a cold or abstract kind of knowing. In fact, it's in this type of understanding that we experience the deepest joy of life, because we are no longer at odds with the world or with ourselves. We're no longer driven blindly by emotions or trapped in ignorance. Instead, we live in harmony with the order of the universe, not out of submission, but through clarity and understanding. But this knowledge doesn't come automatically. It requires a long journey of self-awareness, cultivating reason, and practicing ethical living. It's not a gift reserved for a few. It's a real possibility for anyone willing to understand themselves and the world with honesty and persistence. Spinoza doesn't give shortcuts or magical formulas, but he does show that every person, by nature, has the potential to reach this intuitive view of reality. That's why his philosophy is both deeply rational and profoundly spiritual, because it brings together reason and eternity, knowledge and joy, ethics and freedom. Intuitive knowledge shows us that we are eternal in the measure that we understand things in an eternal way. In other words, the part of us that participates in eternity is not our body, not our memories, and not our social identity. It's the mind when it clearly understands the order of the universe. Spinoza even says that when we reach this level of understanding, we no longer fear death, because we're already united with something that goes beyond it. Not in a religious sense of a soul living in another world, but in the sense of the eternity of reason, which appears in the very act of understanding. That is true freedom, not running away from reality, but understanding it so fully that we become one with it. Intuitive knowledge doesn't offer supernatural salvation, but something even deeper. The peace of someone who lives in the world with wisdom, clarity, and love. And you? Do you settle for surface-level images of reality? Or are you seeking the deeper causes behind what exists? Have you ever felt that quiet joy that comes from understanding something that once seemed chaotic? Are you willing to walk the path from reason to intuition, from fragmentation to eternity? Western philosophy was never the same after Baruch Spinoza. His masterpiece, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order, isn't just a philosophical work. It's a formal provocation, a bold act of faith in reason, and a spiritual exercise in logic. Spinoza didn't just want to express his ideas. He wanted his thoughts to look like truth. By choosing the geometric method, Spinoza broke away from traditional philosophical and theological styles. No narrative chapters, no rhetorical speeches, no examples or quotes from authorities. Instead, he structured his ethics like a geometry book by Euclid, with definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, and scholia. Ethics is a philosophical construction like a mathematical building. Each part must logically support the next, like blocks in a rational structure. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a deeply philosophical and existential statement. To Spinoza, truth is necessary, universal, and eternal, and should be expressed in a language that mirrors those same qualities. Mathematics, with its clarity and precision, seemed to him the purest form of rational thought. If geometry can demonstrate the properties of space with absolute certainty, why not apply that same rigor to the study of God, the human mind, emotions, and freedom? Spinoza's proposal was radical. to build an ethical system like a geometry of the soul, based not on divine commands or moral dogmas, but on rational and demonstrable principles. At the start of the Ethics, Spinoza defines key concepts like substance, attribute, mode, God, and cause of itself. Then he lays out axioms, self-evident truths like, from a given definite cause, a definite effect necessarily follows. From there, he builds proposition after proposition, with strict demonstrations like assembling a logical map of reality. This makes the Ethics a challenging read. It's not a book you skim casually. It demands intellectual effort, patience, and focus. But it's also one of the most rewarding works in the history of philosophy, because once you begin to understand it, it offers a coherent, powerful, and transformative view of life and the universe. By applying the geometric method to ethics, Spinoza was essentially saying, human life is not a chaotic mystery or a drama guided by arbitrary divine will. It's part of a rational order that can and should be understood. Freedom, happiness, and peace of mind don't depend on blind faith or supernatural intervention. They are natural results of knowing things in the right way. So, ethics isn't just a book about morality. It's a work of metaphysics, psychology, epistemology, politics, and above all, a spiritual practice rooted in reason. Spinoza shows that the human mind, when it understands itself and its place in the bigger picture, can free itself from confusion, negative emotions, and the slavery of ignorance. But why did Spinoza choose geometry as his model? The answer is twofold: for logical rigor and philosophical necessity. He believed that true knowledge must be necessary. It can't depend on chance or authority. Just as there's no alternative to the fact that the angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees, there's no alternative to the fact that everything that exists is an expression of the one infinite substance, God or nature, and that humans are part of this whole. This logical necessity reflects the very heart of Spinoza's thought. In his view of reality, nothing happens by chance. Everything follows necessarily from the nature of God. So the geometric method isn't just a writing style, it mirrors the structure of being itself. Spinoza doesn't just talk about reason, he writes with reason. His form reflects his message. His ethics are as precise as the nature they describe. There's no room for the irrational, the arbitrary, or the supernatural. Everything is order, connection, cause, and effect. And here's the paradox. From this rigidity comes freedom. Because for Spinoza, only those who understand are truly free. And understanding requires knowing the causes behind things. By guiding us through this demonstrative path, he shows that freedom doesn't exist outside of necessity. It is the understanding of necessity. The impact of this work goes far beyond its structure. Spinoza's geometric method influenced thinkers like Hegel, Nietzsche, Einstein, and Deleuze, each in their own way, moved by this unique approach to philosophy. Blending the precision of mathematics with the passion of someone searching for mental liberation. Since ancient times, philosophers, religious leaders, and lawmakers have tried to define what is good and what is evil. For many, these concepts are seen as absolute, unchanging and valid across all times, cultures, and situations. Like commandments carved in a divine tablet, they're simply waiting to be obeyed. But Baruch Spinoza breaks away from that mindset in a bold and transformative way. In his ethical system, good and evil aren't absolute categories. They're deeply connected to human emotions. This challenge to traditional morality is one of the most revolutionary aspects of Spinoza's thinking. To him, there is no such thing as good or evil in itself. The universe, as an expression of God or nature, doesn't operate based on moral values. Reality just is. What we call good or evil doesn't come from eternal truths, but from human experiences of pleasure or pain, usefulness or harm. Spinoza writes, "We do not desire something because we judge it to be good. We judge it to be good because we desire it." This flips the logic of traditional morality completely. Instead of assuming there's some objective good we should all follow. Spinoza shows that what we call good is simply whatever increases our ability to exist and thrive, while evil is whatever weakens it. So, good and evil are reflections of our emotional states, not divine rules or metaphysical truths. But that doesn't mean anything goes. This isn't moral relativism in the casual sense, like everyone has their own truth. Spinoza isn't tearing down ethics. He's rebuilding it on stronger, more realistic foundations. Instead of dogmatic principles, he offers a moral framework based on understanding our emotions and seeking what helps us live better. At the heart of this idea is a key concept in Spinoza's ethics: Conatus, the natural drive in every being to persist in its own existence. Anything that supports this drive or increases our power to act brings joy and is considered good. Anything that weakens it causes sadness and is seen as bad. But again, these judgments aren't fixed or universal. They depend on a person's nature, situation, and condition. For example, what's good for a child might be harmful to an adult. A food that strengthens one person might harm another. A cultural habit that supports mental health in one place might seem strange or even dangerous somewhere else. Spinoza acknowledges all this complexity and builds an ethical system grounded in the real world of emotions and relationships without relying on fixed, eternal values. That's exactly why his critique of traditional morality hits so hard. Traditional morality, often rooted in religion, relies on external commands. It enforces rules without asking what's natural or healthy for human beings. It doesn't ask, does this help us live better? Instead, it asks, is this what God wants? Or, is this how we've always done things? Spinoza flips that around. He proposes an ethics based not on obedience, but on understanding. The perfection of things should be judged only by their nature and power. So, good is no longer some ideal floating above us. It's what actually helps us live more actively, more consciously, and more rationally. This is ethics grounded in real life, not imposed from above. This shift also changes how we view negative emotions. Instead of labeling them bad in a moral sense, Spinoza invites us to understand where they come from. If someone feels envy, anger, or fear, that doesn't make them evil. It just means their ability to act is being limited by harmful emotions. The solution isn't punishment, it's clarity. The healing of the soul doesn't come through repression, but through knowledge. That message feels especially relevant today. We're surrounded by rigid moral debates, intense polarization, and snap judgments. Spinoza invites us to replace judgment with thoughtful investigation. Instead of asking if something is good or bad in principle, we should ask, what does this behavior say about the person's inner state? Does it help or hurt their power to act? Is it driven by ignorance or by understanding? This ethics of understanding, not condemnation, is one of Spinoza's greatest contributions. It opens the door to a more mature, compassionate, and rational way of living together. It's also a call for responsibility. If there's no absolute moral truth handed down from above, then it's on us to use reason to find what helps us, and others, live better. To be ethical, in this sense, is to become more aware of the emotions that drive us, and to choose the ones that lead us toward active joy, not reactive sorrow. In the end, Spinoza offers an ethics grounded in real life, where good isn't something in the sky, but the concrete power to live with more clarity, freedom, and harmony. In the middle of all the moral debates throughout Western philosophy, Baruch Spinoza offers a powerful and liberating shift. He argues that good is not defined by divine commandments, social norms, or abstract ideals. For him, good is simply what makes us stronger, more active, more alive. And this increase in power shows itself through one fundamental feeling: joy. Laetitia. In his work, Ethics, Spinoza breaks with centuries of moral thought based on guilt, suppression of desire, or submission to external rules. To him, a truly ethical life doesn't come from denying our emotions, but from understanding them, and using reason to guide them toward what increases our ability to live fully. That's why he states, clearly and directly, "I call good what we know certainly to be useful to us." But what does Spinoza mean by useful? He's not talking about usefulness in a selfish or short-term way. For Spinoza, something is useful if it supports our Conatus, the basic drive of every being to continue existing. So, good is anything that strengthens our power to act, that helps us grow as expressions of infinite substance. And how do we know when that power is growing? Spinoza's answer is through joy. He defines it like this: joy is the transition of a person from a lesser to a greater perfection. So joy isn't just a pleasant feeling, it's an existential signal, a sign that we're becoming stronger, more self-aware, and more aligned with the natural order. Joy isn't a reward given from outside. It's the direct result of living according to reason, cultivating the right emotions, and developing our nature in freedom. This idea that joy is the measure of good completely changes the way we think about morality. It's no longer about obeying rules to please a judging God or following traditions without question. Instead, it's about watching closely, with reason and honesty, to see what makes us stronger and what weakens us, and making choices based on that understanding. Spinoza also draws a line between true, rational, empowering joy and false or passive pleasures, which may feel good in the moment, but actually reduce our long-term strength. For example, giving in to an addiction may bring short-term pleasure, but usually makes us more dependent and passive, lowering our power to act. On the other hand, things like knowledge, true friendship, or inner peace bring active joy. They make us more autonomous, more clear-headed, and more in tune with reality. This distinction is crucial, because not all joy is good just because it feels good. We have to ask, does this joy make me stronger or just distract me? Is it based on clarity or confusion? Does it bring me closer to myself or further away? So for Spinoza, Laetitia, active joy, becomes a kind of inner compass, an ethical guide that points us toward what's truly good. Good is what brings this kind of clear, rational, lasting joy. Evil, on the other hand, is what causes sadness, tristitia, which he defines as the move toward a lower state of being, a weakening of our inner strength. This idea has deep implications beyond just ethics. It touches politics, education, spirituality. Instead of punishing mistakes with guilt or repression, Spinoza says we should understand them as results of ignorance or a drop in personal strength. Instead of preaching sacrifice and self-denial, he encourages us to create the real conditions that allow active joy to grow. This approach is especially radical when compared to the Christian tradition of his time, which often tied goodness to suffering, self-denial, or blind obedience. Spinoza flips that idea. To be virtuous is to be joyful. To be ethical is to live with strength, reason, and happiness. And this joy isn't a luxury. It's a right. It's a real possibility that comes from truly understanding yourself and the world around you. That's why Spinoza says, blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. In other words, to live virtuously, with strength, reason, and freedom, is already to live joyfully. There's no need to wait for some future reward. Freedom and happiness exist in the present, as long as we understand our nature and live in harmony with the natural order of things. This view also brings back the importance of the body and emotions. Spinoza doesn't separate reason from feeling or mind from body. For him, knowing is also feeling, and feeling well is a sign that we are living well. Joy is both a state of the body and of the soul, an existential vibration that tells us, right now, you're being your true self. At the heart of Baruch Spinoza's philosophy lies a bold and revolutionary idea, the rejection of the traditional split between body and mind. Unlike Descartes, who saw them as two separate substances, Spinoza argued that body and mind are simply two ways of expressing the same substance, God or nature. This rejection of Cartesian dualism isn't just a technical debate. It changes how we understand ourselves, the world around us, and the very meaning of human freedom. To understand this shift, we need to revisit René Descartes, the dominant philosophical voice in 17th century Europe. Descartes believed reality was made up of two basic substances: res extensa, or extended substance, referring to physical matter and the body; res cogitans, or thinking substance, referring to the mind, thought, and soul. These two were seen as completely different in nature. The body was governed by mechanical laws, while the mind was conscious, rational, and free. But this raised a serious problem. If the mind and body were so different, how could they interact? How could thought move a body, or physical experiences affect the mind? Spinoza rejects this divide entirely. In his work, Ethics, he lays out a monist view of the universe. There is only one substance, God or nature, and everything that exists is a mode or expression of that substance. While this substance has infinite attributes, humans are only aware of two: thought and extension. This means that mind and body aren't two different things. They are two sides of the same coin. The body and the mind are one and the same thing, conceived under different attributes: thought and extension. In simple terms, we don't have a body and a mind. We are body and mind, expressing the same essence in two different ways. Every thought is connected to a physical state, and every physical state has a corresponding idea. There is no hierarchy, no war between the mind and the body. They are one reality seen from two angles. This idea has powerful implications. First, it breaks down the artificial divide between reason and the body, between thinking and feeling. For Spinoza, reason is not detached from the body. It grows from it. Our thoughts are shaped by our experiences, by the way we interact with the world, by our very physicality. The mind is not above the body. It's the body seen from the perspective of thought. Second, this unity helps us better understand emotions. Passions, feelings, desires. They aren't disturbances of a pure soul. They are real movements within the body and mind as they try to survive and thrive. What we feel doesn't come from a fight between body and soul, but from a harmony or conflict within the forces shaping our being. This also changes how we view self-knowledge. If mind and body are the same, then to know yourself is not just to think, it's to feel, to observe your body, your impulses, your strengths and weaknesses. Rational reflection must go hand in hand with bodily awareness. There is no pure soul floating above the flesh. There is only the real, living human being, thinking, feeling, and trying to understand itself. Another key point is that for Spinoza, the mind doesn't control the body like a ruler commands a nation. That image, still common in many philosophies of consciousness, is replaced with a new one. Body and mind affect each other at the same time. When the body changes, the mind changes. When the mind understands something, the body responds. There is no domination, only coordination. This leads to a more grounded and realistic ethics. Spinoza isn't asking us to suppress the body with the mind. He invites us to organize our emotions through understanding. The mind becomes freer as it learns what causes our feelings, feelings which are, at the same time, movements in the body. And the freer the mind becomes, the more active and empowered the body becomes too. Spinoza's rejection of dualism also frees us from old metaphysical ideas about the soul as something separate and immortal. For him, the soul is not an entity that floats away after death. What's eternal in us is the mind, when it understands things from the perspective of eternity, sub specie eternitatis. True immortality doesn't mean living forever. It means reaching a timeless understanding of reality, here and now. Yes, this idea is radical, but it's also deeply freeing. By uniting body and mind, Spinoza invites us into a more integrated life, one where thinking and feeling, knowing and living, reason and emotion are not in conflict, but in harmony. Baruch Spinoza lived during a time when questioning religious authority meant challenging the core of political, moral, and cultural power. Still, in his bold Theological-Political Treatise, 1670, he dared to write one of the most courageous and influential distinctions in the history of thought: the clear separation between theology and philosophy. For Spinoza, theology, or faith, and philosophy not only have different goals, they should also operate in completely different spheres. The goal of faith is obedience. The goal of philosophy is truth. This isn't just a theoretical argument. It's a vision for intellectual and political freedom. Spinoza understood that mixing faith with reason led to superstition, fanaticism, repression, and ignorance. And contrary to what many feared in his time, he wasn't attacking religion to destroy it, but to free it from interfering with philosophical thought and political life. Faith and philosophy. Two paths, two purposes. In the treatise, Spinoza argues that religious faith has a specific role: to teach moral obedience and encourage justice and kindness. The believer doesn't need to understand the metaphysical truths behind divine commandments. What matters is to act with humility, compassion, and integrity. The aim of faith is not to make people learned, but to make them obedient. So, faith isn't an enemy of reason. It's a moral guide for people who, for whatever reason, aren't pursuing philosophical knowledge. Spinoza recognized that not everyone has access to rational and scientific study of nature, but anyone can act ethically when guided by a religion that promotes the common good. To him, the true essence of religion is simple and universal. Love your neighbor as yourself, practice justice, and live righteously. Philosophy, on the other hand, has a different mission: to seek truth through reason. It doesn't settle for symbols, dogmas, or commandments. A philosopher doesn't accept something as true just because it's in scripture or stated by an authority. A philosopher wants to understand causes, deduce principles, observe nature, and reach clarity through reason. The goal of philosophy is truth. The goal of faith is obedience. By making this distinction, Spinoza wasn't dismissing faith. He just wanted to make sure it didn't stand in the way of thought. For him, when religion tries to replace reason, it stops promoting peace and starts spreading fear, repression, and fanaticism. Spinoza knew that sacred texts had been used for centuries to justify wars, persecute thinkers, silence scientists, and enforce domination. When theology mixes with politics and tries to control ideas, it becomes a dangerous tool of tyranny. He had personal experience with this. At just 23 years old, Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam for his so-called heretical ideas. He knew firsthand the price of thinking freely in a world still ruled by religious orthodoxy. That's why the Theological-Political Treatise is also a passionate defense of freedom of thought and expression. Spinoza believed that the state should allow different forms of belief to coexist, but it shouldn't enforce one religious system as official truth. Religion should serve ethics, not repression. He proposed that the Bible, for instance, be studied like any other historical text. That means understanding its context, language, and moral goals, without assigning eternal and absolute value to every word. To Spinoza, Scripture is ethically meaningful, but it's not a philosophy book or a science manual. Reading it literally is falling into the trap of superstition. Defending philosophy also means defending individual freedom. By defending the independence of philosophy, Spinoza was also defending each person's right to think freely. That's essential for a rational and free society. The philosopher, guided by reason, seeks knowledge of God, nature, and the self without blindly submitting to dogma or outside authorities. This freedom isn't a luxury, it's necessary for human growth. A society that doesn't allow free philosophical inquiry is one that chooses fear and ignorance over understanding. Spinoza was one of the first modern thinkers to firmly argue that the state must protect freedom of thought and speech, especially for philosophers and scientists. In his view, banning rational thought in the name of religion doesn't protect faith, it weakens it. You cannot take away people's freedom to say what they think. Faith and reason. Two pillars of a free society. In the end, Spinoza's goal wasn't to destroy religion or place reason above faith. His vision was for both to live side by side with maturity and respect for their roles. Faith, to guide ethical action for those who don't seek truth through reason. Philosophy, to lead those who want to understand the deeper causes of reality. Each serves its own purpose, and when they stay within their proper roles, together they can help build a more just, peaceful, and free society. For Baruch Spinoza, human beings were not born to live in servitude, not to nature, not to religion, and not to the state. Our essence, as rational beings, is to seek understanding of the world and ourselves. That's why freedom of thought and freedom of expression are not privileges, but fundamental human needs. And it's the role of a rational state, one grounded in reason and focused on the common good, to protect that freedom. This idea is clearly and boldly stated in his Theological-Political Treatise, 1670, one of the most daring defenses of intellectual freedom in modern history. At a time when religious censorship was harsh and philosophical thought was often repressed by political and religious authorities, Spinoza raised his voice to say, "In a free state, every person may think what they want and say what they think." That sentence wasn't just meant to provoke, it was a serious political statement. For Spinoza, the state doesn't exist to control people's minds, but to create conditions where reason can thrive. When political power tries to regulate thought, it doesn't just violate individual rights, it weakens the very foundation of a rational society. Spinoza's political philosophy is built on the idea that living in society shouldn't mean giving up reason. It should mean using it together. The social contract isn't blind submission. It's a rational agreement between people who want to live in peace, justice, and freedom. And for that society to work, every individual must be free to express their thoughts, especially when those thoughts go against the majority. The freedom to philosophize can be granted without endangering the peace of the state or public morality. In fact, it's absolutely necessary for preserving both. Here, Spinoza anticipated ideas that later Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Locke, and Rousseau would explore. The belief that free debate, open criticism, and philosophical inquiry are the engines of justice and political reason. Where freedom of thought is denied, fear, superstition, blind obedience, and ultimately tyranny take over. Spinoza saw firsthand how dangerous it is when religion and politics become one. In theocracies, where religious dogma becomes civil law, disagreement turns into a crime, and criticism becomes blasphemy. In those regimes, philosophers are treated as enemies. They think independently, ask uncomfortable questions, and challenge religious authority. That's what happened to Galileo, and that's what happened to Spinoza himself when he was excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam. That's why Spinoza insisted that the state must not impose an official religion or censor philosophical views that go against tradition. The government's job is to ensure safety, justice, and peaceful coexistence, not to control how people think. This doesn't mean anything goes or that there are no limits. Spinoza recognized that freedom of speech shouldn't be used to incite violence or threaten public order, but he made it clear that can't be an excuse to silence criticism. What he argued for is balance. Everyone should be free to think and speak their mind, as long as their actions don't harm others or disturb public peace. To Spinoza, thinking is the highest expression of human nature. When we think, we explore causes, understand emotions, learn about nature, and find our place in it. Reason isn't a luxury, it's who we are. To block thought is to deny someone their humanity. And beyond that, it weakens the state itself. A government that fears rational thinking is a government that lacks confidence and strength. It's threatened by its own ignorance. Authority that tries to control people's thoughts becomes tyranny. That's why Spinoza believed a rational state should be secular, tolerant, and open to a wide range of ideas. philosophical freedom isn't dangerous. It's necessary for wise governance. For Spinoza, the goal of politics is both simple and powerful: to make individuals as free as possible. That doesn't just mean protecting them from outside threats. It means allowing them to fully develop their capacity for reason. A free citizen is someone who thinks, questions, learns, and understands. And a free state is one that encourages this, not suppresses it. This vision helped lay the foundation for modern democratic values like civil rights, freedom of the press, and academic freedom. Spinoza was one of the first to understand that without intellectual freedom, political freedom is an illusion. Centuries later, his lesson is still relevant. In times of hidden censorship, ideological polarization, and efforts to silence critical voices in the name of morality or order, remembering Spinoza reminds us, thinking isn't dangerous, it's necessary. Freedom of expression is what allows truth to emerge. Philosophical freedom is what drives human progress, and reason is what makes a state just. At a time when questioning religious dogmas meant directly challenging political and social power, Spinoza boldly declared, "Superstition is the greatest enemy of freedom." At the heart of his critique of traditional religion is the conviction that irrational beliefs don't just obscure the truth, they also serve as tools of domination. This sharp critique appears in his Theological-Political Treatise, where Spinoza offers a radically rational interpretation of sacred texts and analyzes religion as a political phenomenon. He doesn't reject faith altogether, but strongly attacks what he calls superstition: belief in miracles, unfathomable mysteries, arbitrary divine punishments, and irrational interpretations of nature. To Spinoza, superstition is born from two main sources: fear and ignorance of natural causes. When people don't understand why things happen, especially dramatic and unpredictable events like natural disasters, illness, or war, they tend to imagine they're being punished or rewarded by invisible forces. It's in that void of uncertainty that superstition takes hold. If people could control everything they do with a fixed purpose, or if luck always worked in their favor, they would never fall under the power of superstition. What Spinoza points out is this: superstition thrives where reason is absent. Instead of seeking the real causes of events, people attribute everything to the will of a human-like God, a being that gets angry, punishes, rewards, and forgives based on mysterious and often contradictory rules. This idea of God isn't just intellectually weak, it's dangerous. It leads people to submit to religious authorities who claim to know what God wants, even when those claims make no sense to reason or experience. Fear then becomes a tool of control. Spinoza understood something many still hesitate to admit. Superstition is useful to authoritarian power. It keeps people dependent, blindly obedient, and self-censoring. Religions that rely on fear of divine punishment or on promises of otherworldly rewards tend to produce subjects, not citizens. People who are afraid to think, afraid to question, afraid to disobey. Superstition, under the pretense of promoting piety, only serves to keep people ignorant and submissive. Spinoza wasn't attacking genuine spirituality. He was attacking the use of religion as a political weapon, a way to manipulate human emotions, especially fear and hope. He argued that rulers and religious leaders often exploit those emotions to keep people in the dark, because an uninformed population is easier to control. This leads us to a key part of Spinoza's critique: the connection between superstition and servitude. When reason is silenced, people stop being agents of their own lives. They become passive, reactive, vulnerable to external authority. Against that, Spinoza offers reason as the antidote to superstition. The path to both spiritual and political freedom, he says, lies in enlightenment. We must understand nature, study our emotions, interpret the Bible with a critical mind, and recognize religious texts as human works, products of a time, a culture, a specific context. That doesn't mean abandoning religion altogether. It means purifying it of illusion and abuse. Spinoza doesn't deny the ethical value of faith. On the contrary, he believes religion can be a force for morality, justice, and peaceful coexistence, as long as it lets go of dogma and superstition. So he proposes a clear distinction between true faith, which teaches love, justice, and compassion, superstition, which promotes fear, guilt, and blind obedience. This distinction is essential, because while faith can inspire an ethical life, superstition fuels fanaticism, intolerance, and repression. Spinoza saw firsthand the horrors that religious fanaticism could cause: wars, persecution, excommunication, censorship. He himself was excommunicated, accused of heresy, called an atheist. But in reality, he was a deeply spiritual thinker, a mystic of reason, a call for clarity. At its core, what Spinoza offers is a rational spirituality, a way of living that doesn't rely on miracles, prophecies, or metaphysical fears, but on a clear understanding of how the world works. To him, what is truly sacred isn't found in rituals or dogmas, but in our ability to love reality as it is, with all its necessary connections, its rational beauty, and eternal strength. So this critique of superstition doesn't destroy religion, it elevates it. It invites us to trade ignorance for inquiry, fear for reason, and submission for freedom. Baruch Spinoza's philosophy doesn't settle for abstract speculation. His view of the world is at once ontological, ethical, and deeply political. And it's in the realm of politics that his thinking becomes especially bold for his time. He defends democracy as the form of government that best aligns with human nature, and as the only one truly capable of combining reason, freedom, and security. Spinoza starts with a simple and realistic idea. Human beings, like everything else that exists, are modes of the one and only substance, God or nature. As such, we are subject to the same universal laws. We act out of necessity, we are driven by emotions, we strive to persist in our being, Conatus, and we only achieve freedom when we understand the causes that shape us. So any political system that aims to be just and stable must be built with this human nature in mind. A regime that tries to suppress emotion, ignore reason, or demand blind obedience will inevitably lead to fear, violence, rebellion, and eventually its own downfall. That's why Spinoza states clearly in his political treatise, democracy is the most natural form of government, and therefore the most stable, because it comes closest to the freedom that nature grants to every man. For him, democracy isn't just about voting or political representation. It's a way of organizing society based on collective participation, legal equality, and freedom of thought. Power isn't concentrated in one person, as in a monarchy, or in a small elite, as in an aristocracy. It's shared among all free citizens. That doesn't mean chaos or anarchy. Spinoza acknowledges the need for laws, institutions, and rules, but those laws should be rational and agreed upon, not forced by tradition, religion, or arbitrary power. The people, as a rational collective, can govern themselves as long as they have the conditions to use their reason freely. One of Spinoza's most important political ideas is that civil freedom is not in conflict with obeying the law. For him, following laws that are the result of collective reasoning isn't submission, it's actually a sign of freedom. True freedom doesn't mean doing whatever you want at any cost. It means acting with an understanding of causes, in harmony with others and with yourself. In a democracy, citizens follow the law because they see it as fair and necessary, not because they're scared of divine punishment or authoritarian decrees. A just law is one that protects the freedom of all, not the privilege of a few. The purpose of the state is not to turn rational people into animals or puppets, but to allow them to freely develop their minds and use reason. Spinoza also sees democracy as a safeguard against religious fanaticism and tyranny. When political power merges with religious authority, leaders tend to impose doctrines, silence dissent, and control thought. This creates a society ruled by fear, the exact opposite of the rational freedom Spinoza defends. In a democracy, by contrast, a diversity of ideas is protected. Everyone has the right to think, to express opinions, and to philosophize. This freedom isn't just tolerated, it's essential for a functioning democratic society. For Spinoza, there is no rational government without philosophical freedom. A government that fears the reason of its own citizens is a government that doesn't trust its own legitimacy. Contrary to what many in his time believed, and still believe today, Spinoza argues that democracy is the most stable system precisely because it allows emotions and reason to be expressed freely. When people feel heard, respected, and free to take part in public life, there's less space for rebellion, violence, or collapse. Suppressing ideas only builds pressure, and that pressure will eventually explode into conflict. That's why Spinoza writes, "Men can never be forced by law or power to all think the same way, but if they are allowed to express what they think, they may gradually reach a rational agreement." Democracy, in this sense, isn't perfect, but it can evolve. Its strength lies in allowing dialogue, disagreement, and public debate. It creates space for reason to grow collectively, not by force, but through persuasion, understanding, and shared experience. Spinoza's defense of democracy is, at its core, a project of human liberation. It's not just about protecting civil rights, but about building a society where each person can become more rational, more active, and more free. Politics, for Spinoza, is not about lies or manipulation. It's the space where reason and freedom meet to build a shared life based on knowledge, justice, and joy. One of Spinoza's most powerful and transformative ideas is this: everything that exists is an expression of the same infinite reality. God, or nature, Deus sive Natura, is the one and only substance, eternal, infinite, and fully self-existing. Everything we know is just a finite mode of that one substance. But what does that actually mean? First, we need to understand what Spinoza means by substance. For him, a substance is something that exists in and by itself. It doesn't depend on anything else to exist or be understood. There is only one true substance like that: God, or nature. Everything else, stones, trees, human bodies, thoughts, feelings, stars, ideas, doesn't exist on its own. It exists in God as modes or expressions of God's being. These modes are what we usually call particular reality, individual things that are finite, temporary, and shaped by outside causes. A human being, for example, is a finite mode. We're born, we live, we die. We're affected by other bodies and ideas, and we don't exist independently. We can only truly understand our existence as a temporary and limited expression of infinite substance. Everything that is in God, and nothing can exist or be understood apart from God. Saying that we are finite modes means recognizing that we depend on the whole. We're not things in themselves, separate from everything else. We are part of an infinite chain of causes, a temporary and local expression of a reality much greater than us. But that doesn't make us insignificant. On the contrary, Spinoza invites us to see that everything, no matter how small or short-lived, is a direct expression of divine being. The universe isn't made up of isolated things, but of unique forms of one single, infinite reality. This view breaks sharply with traditional dualisms like creator versus creature, spirit versus matter, or essence versus appearance. There is no higher world separate from this one. Everything that exists is within the substance. Everything is real to the extent that it expresses the power of being, even if in a limited way. Understanding ourselves as finite modes is a kind of deep philosophical clarity. It means recognizing that we're not the masters of the universe, but also not meaningless accidents. We're active parts of a necessary whole, shaped by causes, feelings, and ideas. And because of that, we're capable of knowledge and even freedom, as long as we understand our place within the order of reality. For Baruch Spinoza, reality didn't begin at a specific moment in time. Against traditional views that imagine a God creating the universe out of nothing, Spinoza proposes something much deeper and more radical. The world is eternal because it's a necessary expression of God's own essence. There was no before when the world didn't exist, and no after when it suddenly came into being. The world, as we know it, has always existed because God is the eternal substance that reveals itself in everything that is. This idea is directly tied to his core principle: Deus, sive, Natura, God or nature. Spinoza doesn't see God as a personal being who steps in and acts on the universe. Instead, he sees God as the infinite reality whose attributes are expressed in everything. That means the world isn't something separate from God, nor something he created by choice. It's a direct consequence, a necessary expression of the divine essence. Everything that is in God, and nothing can exist or even be imagined without God. So what we call the world wasn't created at a point in time. It's an eternal expression of divine substance. God doesn't choose to create, God is, and because God exists, everything else exists as part of that infinite being. This idea has major implications. First, it challenges the belief in absolute time as something outside of things. For Spinoza, time isn't something that governs existence. It's just the limited way humans perceive the changes in bodies and ideas. Eternity, in this view, doesn't mean endless time. It means existence itself, understood without any reference to before or after. So when Spinoza says the world is eternal, he's not saying it stretches forever like a timeline. He's saying the world is a constant and necessary expression of divine being, something that doesn't depend on anything else to exist. And more than that, this idea asks us to stop seeing the universe as a random or voluntary product. Everything that happens follows unchanging natural laws. These laws aren't the result of chance or some mysterious will. Every event, every being, every relationship, all of it is part of a necessary, infinite, and impersonal order. To understand this eternity, for Spinoza, is to move closer to true freedom. Because when we stop seeing the world as the result of divine whims or unpredictable forces, we start to see things as they really are, not as we wish they were. The eternity of the world doesn't push us away from life. It brings us closer to it. It helps us accept reality for what it is, and everything that happens as part of nature's necessary flow. And once we understand that clearly, we live with more calm, awareness, and strength. Imagine living in a society where thinking differently is dangerous, where simply expressing a philosophical doubt could lead to punishment, censorship, or even persecution. History is full of examples like this, and it was in exactly this kind of world that Baruch Spinoza wrote his works. But he didn't just resist being silenced. He offered a bold new way of thinking about the role of the state, a vision built not on fear, but on reason. In Spinoza's view, the purpose of the state isn't to control people's minds or suppress their questions. Instead, it should promote intellectual freedom, protect critical thinking, and allow every individual to fully develop their ability to reason. That wasn't just a bold idea in the 1600s. It was deeply subversive. Spinoza understood that when governments try to regulate what people are allowed to think or say, it's not just personal freedom that's at risk, it's the health of political life itself. A society only becomes truly stable and just when its citizens can think freely and without fear. When free thought isn't seen as a threat, but as a vital part of collective life. He puts it plainly in his Theological-Political treatise. The goal of politics is freedom. But we need to be clear. This freedom isn't about chaos or anarchy. Spinoza isn't saying people should just do whatever they want. On the contrary, he argues that true freedom comes from the use of reason, not from blindly following impulses or emotions. So, the role of the state is to create conditions where people can live safely, but also think for themselves, ask questions, investigate, and develop their own ideas. Even about religion, politics, and philosophy, that means the state must not fear disagreement. It must accept the existence of many opinions and never align itself with any one religious doctrine to impose a single view of the world. Spinoza strongly opposed theocracy and religious fanaticism, seeing them as enemies of reason and peaceful coexistence. Even more, he believed that a government that tries to silence philosophy only harms itself, because it shuts down dialogue, destroys trust, and feeds resentment. On the other hand, when thought is free, people become more conscious citizens, and the state becomes stronger and more legitimate. Spinoza had the courage and clarity to anticipate the foundations of what we now call true democracy. Freedom of expression, secular government, tolerance, and faith in human reason. His message is still relevant today. Reason needs space to grow, and if politics wants to be fair, it must be willing to listen. In a time when the Bible's authority was unquestioned and treated as the literal word of God, Baruch Spinoza dared to look at this sacred text from a different perspective. Not as a book of absolute metaphysical truths, but as a historical work written by human beings in specific cultural contexts with moral and political intentions. This bold and deeply critical approach appears clearly in his Theological-Political treatise, where Spinoza introduces a new way to read Scripture. Instead of interpreting the Bible as a divine code filled with supernatural mysteries, he argues that it should be studied like any other historical document, by examining its time period, language, customs, authors, and the purposes behind its writing. According to Spinoza, many misunderstandings and conflicts come from trying to find in the Bible things it was never meant to provide. It wasn't written to teach philosophy, metaphysics, or science. Its purpose isn't to explain the nature of reality or offer a rational system of the world. The Bible's main goal is to guide human behavior, to encourage justice, compassion, and moral living. Scripture teaches only obedience, not truth as understood by reason. With this, Spinoza makes a clear and courageous distinction. The Bible is morally valuable, but it does not carry philosophical authority. Its importance lies in its ethical message, in its ability to promote values like love for others, forgiveness, and charity, not in its use as a source of rational knowledge about God, nature, or existence. Spinoza's critique has a deeper purpose: to free reason from being controlled by religion. When people try to use the Bible as the standard for philosophical truth, they end up limiting thought, suppressing doubt, and shutting down meaningful debate. Spinoza wants the exact opposite: to create space for reason to operate independently, without fear of going against dogmatic interpretations. At the same time, he doesn't reject the Bible. He respects it as a powerful ethical tool, but he denies that its teachings should have authority over philosophical thought. In his view, mixing theology and philosophy leads to confusion, superstition, and control, which is why each should remain in its own proper domain. In this way, Spinoza isn't attacking faith. He's defending the freedom to think. His critique of the Bible's authority is really a call for clarity, to respect Scripture for what it truly is, and to free reason to become what it is truly capable of being. Among the many things that make Spinoza's work unique in the history of philosophy, perhaps nothing is more striking at first glance than the way he writes. When you open his masterpiece, Ethics Demonstrated in Geometrical Order, you don't find typical essays or loose reflections. Instead, you see axioms, definitions, propositions, demonstrations, and corollaries, as if you were reading a geometry textbook by Euclid. But this wasn't just a stylistic choice. It reflected something much deeper. Spinoza's belief that philosophy should pursue truth with the same rigor, clarity, and logical necessity we find in mathematics. For Spinoza, doing philosophy isn't about sharing opinions or persuading with fancy words. It's about demonstrating ideas through clear, rational evidence. He believed that the human mind, when guided by reason, can reach solid knowledge of reality. But to do that, we need to avoid confusion, vague assumptions, and unclear language, things that often show up even in philosophical writing. That's why he thought it was so important to use a method that forces the thinker to define terms precisely, justify every step in the argument, and build a system where each idea logically follows from the previous one. Nothing prevents the nature of God, just like everything else, from being demonstrated using the same method used to prove mathematical truths. Spinoza saw geometry as the model of intellectual clarity. Instead of starting with faith, authority, or tradition, he begins with universal rational principles, ideas that stand on their own, and builds his philosophy like a logical structure. For him, this was the only legitimate way to approach the truth. This method also tells us something important about his view of knowledge. Truth isn't something personal or subjective. It's something that can be demonstrated to any rational mind. Just like a geometric theorem convinces anyone who follows the steps, philosophy too should be based on rational, objective evidence. Of course, Spinoza understood that not everyone has the same level of understanding. But the geometric method was, for him, a kind of guiding ideal, a model of how we should strive to think clearly, organize our ideas carefully, and avoid mistakes caused by rushing, emotions, or superstition. In this model, to philosophize means to seek the necessity behind things, to understand why they are the way they are, not how we wish they were. It means following the path of reason, not the pull of emotion. Understanding what it means to have an adequate idea is essential to knowing how humans can free themselves from error, reach true knowledge, and live rationally. According to Spinoza, the human mind is capable of knowing the truth, but it's also vulnerable to confusion, bias, and ignorance. The difference between these states lies in the kind of ideas we have, either adequate or inadequate ideas. But what makes an idea one or the other? An adequate idea, according to Spinoza, is one that clearly and completely contains the causes of the thing it's about. It's an idea based on understanding the natural order of things, fitting logically and necessarily within a system of reason. It's true not because it matches some external reality, but because it's built in a coherent, clear, and complete way within the rational mind itself. I call an idea true or adequate when, considered on its own, without reference to the object, it has all the internal characteristics of a true idea. On the other hand, an inadequate idea is incomplete, confused, or fragmented. It usually comes from disorganized sensory experiences, from things happening in the body that the mind doesn't fully understand. For example, if you see a dark cloud and hear thunder and conclude that God is angry, that's an inadequate idea. It doesn't come from knowing the real causes of what you saw and heard. It's just a projection of human emotions onto natural events, something Spinoza calls confused imagination. This distinction isn't just about knowledge, it's also ethical and deeply personal. For Spinoza, living under the control of inadequate ideas means living in bondage, being ruled by emotions, fear, and superstition. But living with adequate ideas means living actively, rationally, and freely. For Spinoza, freedom doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It means acting according to reason, guided by a clear understanding of the causes that shape who we are. So, the more adequate ideas we have, the better we understand the world and ourselves, and the more capable we become of acting freely and with purpose. This way of thinking also changes how we view error. Spinoza doesn't see error as a sin or a failure, but as a result of incomplete knowledge. Error isn't something in itself. It's just what happens when an idea is only partially formed or poorly understood. That's why developing adequate ideas is the path to both truth and freedom. And that path requires effort, focus, study, and reflection. But for Spinoza, it's also how we rise to our true rational nature. For many people, the idea that things could have turned out differently feels natural. We're used to thinking in terms of possibilities, free choices, and unexpected twists. But Baruch Spinoza challenges this view and firmly states, nothing happens by chance. Everything that exists, everything that happens, follows a necessary order. determined by the eternal laws of nature. This is the foundation of ontological determinism, the belief that everything is a consequence of the essence of the one and only substance, God or nature, which expresses itself in infinite ways. So, there are no random events, no exceptions in how reality unfolds. Even what we call accidents or coincidences are actually the result of causes we simply don't understand. In nature, nothing happens that can be blamed on any defect in her. She is always the same, and her power and ability to act are always the same. Spinoza doesn't deny that we often feel surprised or unsure about things, but those feelings reveal the limits of our understanding, not a flaw in the universe. When we don't know all the causes that led to a specific event, we label it as unpredictable, but that's really just a reflection of our ignorance. For Spinoza, reality is a perfect, coherent system where every being, every event, every relationship is connected through endless chains of cause and effect. Nothing escapes this necessary order. Whatever exists, exists because it couldn't have been otherwise. And this determinism isn't just about nature or the physical world. It includes human life too. Our thoughts, desires, emotions, and decisions are also part of nature's order. That means humans aren't some special exception. We're not a kingdom within a kingdom, as Spinoza puts it, acting outside of natural laws. On the contrary, our actions come from causes just as necessary as the motion of the planets or the growth of a tree. This perspective might seem unsettling at first. After all, we're used to thinking about free will and personal responsibility. But Spinoza doesn't reject responsibility. He redefines it. Being responsible means understanding the causes that shape us and acting in line with that understanding. The more we understand the necessity within us, the freer we become. Because for Spinoza, freedom is the awareness of necessity. In this way, Spinoza turns determinism into a path toward liberation. There's no such thing as chance, and that's actually good news, because once we realize that everything follows an intelligible order, we can live with more clarity, acceptance, and power to act. At a time when traditional theology saw God as a being separate from the world, a creator and ruler existing apart from his creation, Baruch Spinoza introduced a revolutionary idea. God is not outside the world. God is the world. This is the essence of the concept of immanence, and it's perhaps the most radical and defining feature of Spinoza's philosophy. Spinoza breaks from the idea of transcendence by saying that God is not a personal being who acts with intentions, desires, or plans. For Spinoza, God is the one, infinite, eternal substance, and everything that exists is simply an expression of that substance. Everything, from the tiniest particle to the vastest thought, exists in God, and nothing can exist or even be imagined without him. Everything that is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. With this view, Spinoza completely redefines the relationship between God and the world. There aren't two separate realms, like spiritual and material, creator and creation. There is only one single necessary reality, expressing itself in infinite ways. This reality is God nature, Deus, sive, Natura, and everything that exists is just a finite mode or manifestation of it. This way of thinking eliminates the metaphysical gap between God and the world. There's no longer a place for a God who intervenes, punishes, or rewards based on human behavior. Instead, Spinoza invites us to see the divine in the order of reality itself, in the chain of causes and effects, in the rational structure of the universe. This idea calls for a whole new kind of spirituality. It's not about worshipping some invisible being in the sky. It's about understanding and loving reality exactly as it is. Spinoza's ethics are deeply tied to his metaphysics. To live well is to live in harmony with the natural order, knowing that everything that happens flows from the necessity of this one substance. Immanence, in this sense, doesn't make God ordinary or reduce his importance. On the contrary, it raises the world itself to the level of the sacred. Everything that exists is an expression of God's infinite power, including us. That gives reality a kind of quiet greatness, a rational beauty that doesn't rely on miracles or supernatural revelations. For Spinoza, letting go of transcendence isn't denying God. It's finding him where he has always been, in the very structure of being. And when we recognize this deep unity between ourselves and the whole, we open the door to a way of life that's more clear-minded, more free, and, perhaps surprisingly, more sacred. Among the core ideas in Spinoza's philosophy, few are more important than the concept of causa sui, a Latin phrase meaning cause of itself. For Spinoza, God is the only being whose existence doesn't depend on anything outside of himself. God exists because it's in his very nature to exist. Unlike finite beings, which rely on something else to exist, like prior causes, material conditions, time, or motion, God, as an infinite substance, is completely self-sufficient. His essence includes his existence, which means that to think of God is to think of a being that must exist. By substance, I understand that which exists in itself and is conceived through itself, meaning its concept doesn't require the concept of anything else to be formed. Spinoza isn't just repeating ideas from classical theology. He's redefining what we mean by God, bon. By saying that God is causa sui, he's rejecting any idea of a God who is dependent, who chooses to exist, or who acts based on free will at specific moments. In Spinoza's view, God isn't one being among others. He is being itself, the one, eternal, infinite substance from which everything else flows. To say that God is causa sui means that he wasn't created, didn't start existing at some point, and can't be understood as a separate entity from the world. That's why Spinoza famously says that God and nature are one and the same, Deus sive Natura. Nature, in all its order and necessity, is the direct expression of the divine essence, and because that essence is infinite, it could never not exist. This view completely rejects the common theistic idea of creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. For Spinoza, nothing comes from nothing, and nothing happens without a proper cause. The universe wasn't brought into existence by a divine decision. It has always existed as a necessary outcome of God's eternal, active nature. By identifying God as causa sui, Spinoza also creates a clear way to separate what is absolute from what is conditional. Anything that depends on something else to exist is finite, limited, and subject to change. Only what exists purely through its own nature can be considered necessary, eternal, and infinite. And that's exactly what makes God the foundation of everything. He is the cause of himself, and therefore the cause of all things. Everything that exists is part of this infinite substance, not as something external or created at random, but as expressions of a power that has no origin outside of itself. One of the core beliefs in the Judeo-Christian tradition is that God created the world ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing, by a free act of will. Baruch Spinoza strongly opposed this idea. To him, nothing can come from nothing. The notion of an absolute creation made by the voluntary decision of a transcendent being goes against both reason and the very structure of reality. In Spinoza's philosophy, God is not some external agent who brought the world into being from a void. On the contrary, God is the infinite and eternal substance, nature in its totality. Spinoza makes it clear, God didn't create the world as something separate from himself. The world is simply God in expression. So everything that exists is necessary, because it flows directly from the divine essence. God is the immanent cause of all things, not a transient cause. That means there's no such thing as an absolute beginning of existence. The world wasn't created at a certain point in time. It has always existed, because it is a necessary expression of God's nature. There is no will of God deciding to create. There is only the eternal unfolding of what God is. Spinoza criticizes the idea of creation ex nihilo for several reasons. First, It assumes that something can come into being without a cause, which violates the principle of sufficient reason. Everything that exists must have a cause or a reason for existing. Second, it assigns to God a will similar to that of a human, with choices, preferences, and intentions. For Spinoza, that's just a projection of human qualities onto the divine, not a rational understanding of God. And beyond that, if God created the world by free will, that means he could have chosen not to create, which would make the existence of the world optional or accidental, not necessary. But for Spinoza, everything that exists out of the necessity of God's own nature. Reality is the result of divine nature, not of divine desire. This rejection of creation from nothing has deep consequences. It completely changes how we understand God, nature, and existence. We don't live in a world that was arbitrarily created by a separate being. We are part of an eternal, infinite, and necessary order. God isn't above or outside that order. God is that order. So instead of the image of a God who creates, Spinoza gives us a God who is, a God whose essence is existence itself. Everything that exists in God, and everything that happens out of necessity, not by chance, and not by divine will. Thank you so much for taking the time, attention, and curiosity to go on this journey. Philosophizing isn't easy, and Spinoza shows us that understanding reality takes effort, but it also brings clarity, peace of mind, and inner strength. If this content made sense to you, help this project reach more people. Subscribe to the channel right now. It supports our work and helps keep philosophy deep, accessible, and free. Like the video so YouTube knows this content is valuable. Leave a comment. What part of this journey with Spinoza impacted you the most? What lesson will you carry with you in life? And don't leave just yet. There's so much more philosophy here on the channel. From Socrates to Nietzsche, from ethics to metaphysics, all with depth, clarity, and a critical eye. Stick around, explore the other videos, and keep building your rational freedom, one clear idea at a time. See you in the next video. Until then, and in Spinoza's own words, peace is not the absence of war, it is a virtue, a state of mind, a disposition for kindness, trust, and justice.